Public Policy for a Just Digital India. Today we convene to delve into a critical aspect of India's and, of course, the globe's journey towards a digitally empowered society, analyzing the pivotal role of policy in supporting the emergence and sustainability of alternative digital models. I'm excited to hear from our diverse panelists on how they think we should navigate the complex landscape of public policy for a just digital India. I will set up our panel today with a short note on the context and leave our panelists with a question for them to answer. As India aims to become a leader in the digital economy, it stands at the intersection of immense potential with critical challenges in realizing this goal. With the largest and most diverse population globally, with uneven economic growth, there are more challenges to in the way for India's growth than there are easy pathways. And our growth trajectory has always presented a paradox. The very policies that accelerate economic development have also led to the rise of large private conglomerates, both in the digital economy and otherwise. They have caused deepening wealth divides, new forms of control and surveillance that reinforce social divisions on the lines of gender, caste, religion, and other such factors. In India and around the world, those who own the infrastructure and the interfaces of the digital economy have also centralized power over their users. This centralized power forces out the state as a key actor in regulating this digital economy. So, this concentration of economic power can very well inadvertently stifle innovation, suppress the growth of alternative models and small businesses, and the resilience of each and every person who uses any platform for their livelihoods. We have seen in the last 10 years gig workers having to shuffle between policy and legal domains, information technology, labor law, social protection laws, motor vehicles laws, trying to find a home to place their concerns and trying to find a home to find their solutions without really finding one. The emergence and sustainability of these alternative digital platforms is key for us to move forward. And so the question I pose to our panel today is, given India's history of having this kind of economic growth, how can policymakers foster innovation of the alternative digital economy and a more just digital economy? So, panelists today have the opportunity to present us with one policy pitch that they think can move us towards a more just digital economy. And everyone has been asked to speak for about 5 to 6 minutes. And I will please ask Anita to start us off. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to say that this is really a very vast area. And of course, anything and everything to do with policy that is digital has an implication for the entirety of society and economy. So, just to say that a just India is possible when we, the people that make India, capable of facing our human futures and also capable of making those futures humane. So I think that we need a kind of three-pronged approach that policymakers could take, and these have to do with digital citizenship, digital rights, and digital infrastructures. So with regard to digital citizenship, what the digital transition essentially means is that it is all about a people-led transition, right? We've heard about the industrial revolution in the in the opening. Now, today we actually see many programs, corporate-led community initiatives, public-private partnerships, large corporations that are working on e-governance projects, and many also seek to build in some component of inclusion. But this is often a very punishing kind of an inclusion, and it ends up assimilating people into an exploitative data value chain that really leaves their current material condition completely untouched. We seem to also be focusing very narrowly on enskillment, but what we actually need is a certain vibrancy in a civic sphere where critical thinking, reasoning, creativity are encouraged within the pedagogy, within the work environment, and contextually embedded innovation is privileged. And I quite like that entire question that was posed in the morning by Dr. Unikrishnan, which is about innovation for what? So innovation for what is an important question, such as innovation for whom. And innovation certainly cannot be disembedded. Interestingly, we just read recently, while also researching for this conference, that Europe has announced 2025 as the year of digital citizenship education. So, a certain dedicated focus on digital citizenship education, which I think stands us in good stead, which is about what is it that is required to make a society aware of the context in which the future generations are going to play an active role, agentic role, and exercise their autonomy. In 2021, Uruguay came out with a strategy of digital citizenship for a society of information and knowledge, and this was a process that was supported by UNESCO. And this was all about reflective and critical use of technologies. I would also say that Kerala state has attempted this kind of approach through the Akshaya program, then the Sri Shakti program, and now aims to attain 100% digital literacy. So literacy is not just about as they would say in alphanumeric literacy, it is not just about learning to read and write, it is to learn to think critically and to create the enabling policy conditions. Such as in certain districts in Kerala, a couple of years ago during the pandemic, I was privileged to share a panel discussion with the district collector who had initiated in schools a module on misinformation. And that I think is the nature of what we need in the public education system. The second prong I would like to speak about is a digital rights framework that's both individual and collective. I think what is very, very, I think, bare bones today and very evident to everybody today is that the digital paradigm has destabilized the normative basis of our shared coexistence. So what used to be the right to freedom today is completely, shaped by what is the internet doing to that freedom. So similarly, data rights, for example, have become very crucial for labor rights, the right to health, the right to knowledge, and also new rights, vocabularies, and taxonomies have come about as the right to be forgotten, the right to access data. And in the previous panel, someone spoke about data interoperability. And all these debates are also tying up in the global context where sometimes IT for Change also works, which is the right to self-determination of countries today is seen to be tied to the right to data sovereignty. So all of this are just the tip of the norm shift iceberg. I think there is a lot of things to be done within that context. And the EU's GDPR is pioneering. I'll pick it up, no problem. The EU's GDPR is pioneering, no doubt, but scholars still say that it falls short of recognizing individual autonomy, that everything is tweaked within the data protection law just so that people are better able to participate in the market, just so that the market is better able to function in a mainstream platform economy that nobody questions. So same also for the AI regulation debates. They have come under flack because a whole host of concerns have arisen, and access to public information and privately controlled algorithmic systems are not really easily available. You have to justify within a risk assessment system, oh, is this a high risk system? Then we can ask questions. But who decides what is risk for society, what is harm for society? And once that is determined, who decides what is low risk and what is high risk, right? So just like in the environmental debates of the yesteryears, we need to apply the precautionary principle and we need to have certain rights without having to justify why we need those rights. And I think that there is also another dimension of positive rights, which is a right to share in the value of data. So the idea of data value, which is now completely consuming the World Economic Forum, the OECD countries, is how do you compute data value when it's not reflected in the GDP, right? So that is an important exercise for the next decade, I'm sure, and econometricians will apply themselves to it, but I think all of us need to be there to say the public and social value of data is important. Indigenous people, peasants, traders, cooperatives, collectives of feminists, all of these need to have a share in the data value. And my final call, I think, if I have 30 more seconds, is that okay? Is that we need to achieve both democratic integrity and distributive integrity. So how do we achieve democratic and distributive integrity? And that, I think, hinges very much on the infrastructures of digitality, because every infrastructure in society today is more or less digitalized or will be digitalized. So looking at the infrastructure question, not in terms of the silos of digital infrastructure and non-digital infrastructure, but to look at the infrastructure question anew in order for it to be rooted in democratic and distributive integrity is very important. Recently, and there is a political opening here in keeping with that policy question that Aditi posed, there was a G20 declaration in which digital public goods have been heralded as being very important. But shaping those digital public goods and the regimes of those digital public goods is very important. Who is the public in public goods is a very old question, but that question comes back again, and it has to be squarely placed on how, and this is because research in Brazil, in the context of AI regulation, for instance, has shown how consultative processes have really fallen short, right? Public consultations have really not taken place. So when we actually talk about putting in place digital public goods, yes, there is a hurry, there is a haste, but public consultations are very important. Barcelona is often seen as a very important example. You did mention certain exemplars, Trebor. And in this, I would like to show how data sovereignty and public ownership of data has been seen repeatedly as an important idea in the city of Barcelona. And I just quote Francisca Braya, who is the architect of the Barcelona Digital Commons experiment. And she says, now we have a big contract with Vodafone, and every month Vodafone has given machine readable data to City Hall. Before that, it didn't happen. They just took all the data and used it for their benefit. So I would just stop here. I think there's a lot to be said about infrastructures, and I do hope in the next couple of days we flesh that out. And so this triumvirate of digital rights, digital citizenship, and digital infrastructure is something I think public policy should look at. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anita. I also want to mention that this will be a multilingual panel. So Sheikh sir will speak in Hindi later. But right now, I would like to ask Mr. Balu Iyer if you could unmute yourself and share with us what your policy pitch would be for this session.
Good morning. Are you all able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Let me begin by congratulating Platform Cooperative Consortium and the IT for Change for bringing us together for this Roots of Resilience conference. And I appreciate the invitation to my colleagues and me from the International Cooperative Alliance to be part of various sessions during the conference. The 3 points on policy that I would like to make, and later a few other points for consideration. On policy, I would look at how we use the existing or improve existing policies to see the fit, identify what is missing and how we can include. And in this, there are 3 things which I would like to point out. One is, how do we make sure that inclusion in policy is meaningful and effective? 2, how does policy look beyond regular players? As was mentioned at the opening and by Anita, that you have the regular players, the private players, where there is a lot of concentration of power. So how do we look at the larger ecosystem and see how it could be broad-based? And finally, how do we move beyond infrastructure and regulation? I know there have been points made that the infrastructure is controlled, but I would say that we need to also look beyond infrastructure and see how we can aim at making it more, ensuring fairness, inclusivity, and ethical practices. And let me give a few examples in each of my points. And there is no surprise that I'm going to look at these from the lens of cooperatives. The first point in terms of making it meaningful, the government of India through the Ministry of Cooperation, and this ministry was formed in 2020-21, is encouraging cooperatives to take part in the government e-marketplace, or it's called GEM, which is dedicated to an e-market dedicated for different groups and services, which can be procured by government organizations and departments. So cooperatives are encouraged to come on board and display the product. That's one. The second is the ministry is also getting cooperatives, specifically the primary agricultural cooperative societies or PACs, to be involved in the Common Services Center. And this is part of India's digital infrastructure as a utility to every citizen, that there will be common service centers where services can be provided to citizens. And the Ministry of Cooperation has gone ahead and signed agreements with NITI and NABARD. In both these cases, while cooperatives have been included, it is not clear how much it has gone beyond the headlines. How much of it is happening, or what kind of preferences are being given, what is the kind of results that we can see by cooperatives taking part in it. So just making sure, just mentioning that cooperatives should be part of it does not make it meaningful, and does not make it effective. And I'm sure Shaik Salauddin can speak more about this, for there have been announcements made in Rajasthan and other states on the gig and platform worker economy. But how much of these have gone behind the headlines? So how do we make sure that when policy is there, how do we make it inclusive and effective? Second is in terms of broad basing it. Sakshi Khurana is also here on the panel, and she will be talking about, I'm assuming, the NITI Aayog's report on India's booming gig and platform economy. But when we looked at the report, there is limited mention about collectives, and it is looking at it from our perspective more from a private lens. So we were planning to have discussions with them and look at the potential of collectivization, and to situate platform cooperatives in the Indian policy context. So again, when we are looking at it from a policy lens, we need to look beyond the regular players and look at how the larger ecosystem can be broad-based, and how others can also be involved in it. And for me, the final point in terms of beyond infrastructure and regulation, we need to also ensure fairness, inclusivity, and practices. Again, India has a draft national cooperative policy. It is under discussion. And when we look at, there is mention about digital transformation in the cooperative sector. And when we look at it, the focus is on saying, okay, we need to have networks, we need to have applications, we need to have services which provide, the infrastructure needs to be in place. And you need to have databases, protocols, standard operative procedures, et cetera, et cetera. It also says that the objective of digital transformation, in addition to ease of doing business, should be to see how we can regulate better, how we can make regulation more transparent, paperless, etc. But again, the point here is infrastructure is just one point, but how do we ensure that there is more involvement or better transparency in terms of governance, better working in terms of involving member? Just focusing on the infrastructure is not going to ensure that we have a just system in place. Beyond this, there are 6 aspects that I would like to, in terms of policy, to look at. One is, in the case of India, we need to have a harmonization of laws. When we look at cooperatives in India, you have it both at a central level and at a state level. How do we ensure that we work towards harmonizing? How do we facilitate dialogue between the state governments and the center, rather than just it coming top down? The other is in terms of how do we empower local communities? How do we leverage technology to not only streamline operations, but also involve financial inclusion and bridge the digital divide, bridge also the urban and rural digital divide, address the gender gaps in digital access. Recently, India had the G20 summit, and in the G20, one of the policy action items, as far as financial inclusion goes, it says that we need to promote primary cooperatives and self-help groups. Again, the SHGs are largely women, as the physical touch points for digital delivery of last mile financial services. So the G20 policy task, the B20 of the G20 is asking governments to create framework for collaboration between fintech companies, primary cooperatives, self-help groups to deliver financial services in a phygital mode, that is providing digital financial services at the last mile. So again, how do we leverage, while there are things mentioned in the policy documents, how do we leverage that? How do we make sure that it is actually put into practice? We also need to look at it in terms of decentralized governance. Earlier in the introduction, and Anita also mentioned that there is limited digital rights, there is the power concentration. Cooperatives as models are much more people-centered, more grassroots level. So how do we ensure that we use digital technology and digital practices to ensure that it's much more transparent, there is trust and democratic decision making. Very important also to have
Balu, can
digital
I ask
education.
you to wrap up in 30 seconds?
Yeah, I'll do that.
Thank you.
In terms of digital education and skill development, again, when we look at it online, it largely tends to be, language tends to be English. How do we ensure that local languages are put in place? How do we ensure that digital literacy is part of the curricula and we provide training in this regard? And finally, as part of this conference, we are talking about platform cooperatives. When we look at the national cooperative policy of India, they talk about digital transformation, but there is hardly any mention about platform cooperatives. Same is the case with the NITI Aayog report. There is hardly any mention about platform cooperatives. While we are advocating for it, we need to also ensure that these policy documents incorporate platform cooperatives and other modes that we are talking about. And finally, my last point is that we also need access to funding. It's not just in terms of that it's not all automatically going to happen. We need to have funding. We need to have grants, specific mechanisms in place, which would help in ensuring that alternative platforms, alternative ways are financed and are able to also flourish in this larger ecosystem. So thank you very much for allowing me to take part in your conference.
Thank you so much, Balu. And really, I think useful intervention on moving beyond infrastructure and regulation also. Kiran, can I please ask you to speak next?
Hi. So I want to speak about digital knowledge societies. This is not a new concept. I've been part of them for at least 25 years, and they go back even longer. And effectively, what I'm talking about is a society, which is a group of people who have mutual interest in some knowledge, who only talk to each other through a digital mechanism. If you go back to the late 90s, it would have been an email list. Since then, we have moved on to other technologies. We use IRC, we use Slack, we use WhatsApp these days, or Discord, or anything else where this group of people exists only in the digital realm. They have no physical presence, unless they choose to have a small meeting in person. And I'm going to use WhatsApp as a proxy for all these various forms going forward. So now most of these groups tend to be almost digital only, unless they meet in person. And if we had to have a Linux user group meeting in the 90s, and you would go rent out a hall to meet in and have a presentation or whatnot. And then when it came time to pay for expenses, because the group does not legally exist, it can't have a bank account, it can't have a payment flow. So what happens instead is that you just collect cash from everyone who walks in and settle the entire thing in cash. And that does not work anymore. Now with electronic payments, what's happening is that if you're not a legal entity, some individual is potentially exposing themselves for tax harassment, saying you're handling money, where's the tax being collected in all this, where is the proof of income, and so on. So we have this problem where a group that mostly never needs legal recognition has roadblocks that they can't cross without registering. And when you need to do that, what you typically do is use the Societies Act, which is a state level law in India. So there's the Karnataka Societies Act, there'll be one in Kerala, there'll be one in Tamil Nadu, and so on. And you go register under the Societies Act saying that we are a society of people with mutual interest, and our bylaws say that everybody in the society has equal rights. It's a membership base, and we make decisions as a group, but we are a legal entity, and therefore we have a bank account, and so on. The moment you get into that, then you start getting into the problems of legal definitions of a society. And one of the things that's true in the case of India is these acts are fairly archaic. They date back to the 1950s. One of the requirements of, say, the Karnataka Societies Act, which I'm familiar with because I have operated in societies in Karnataka, is you can't have a decision made on behalf of members as a society unless the meeting is held in person. It cannot be done online. Yeah? And the meeting must also have quorum, which is you must have a minimum number of members show up at the meeting. And if you cannot attain quorum, then you're allowed to defer the meeting by half an hour, and then you can proceed without quorum. And what happens now is that a WhatsApp group having to show up for a physical meeting is not always tenable, because the whole point of your digital group is that you don't care to show up physically. And when you register the society, you must also provide a physical address, which is where your meetings are going to be held. So what typically happens is when you make this leap from being purely digital to saying we have reasons that require legal registration, is then you look at saying, where do you register this? Well, somebody says, okay, I'll offer you my house or my office. We'll make that the registered address. What happens when you need to have a meeting and people don't show up? The person who owns this address can say, look, meeting in my house tomorrow morning. Yeah? It's official address. If you don't show up, I'll wait half an hour and then I'll make the decisions on behalf of the group. And so that's suddenly a form of hijack, and because this person who has the power to hold a physical meeting at their convenience has legal authority over the members, even though your bylaws specifically say it's a membership thing where everybody has equal rights. So this is the gap in the law, and you would have expected that with the pandemic, the law would have changed to allow virtual meetings, but that is still not the case. You still must have a meeting in person, okay? And so what happens here, and I've seen this multiple times with multiple societies where we have gone from being digital to registering, is that's the point where you effectively kill the organization, because the bureaucracy that you bring to the table is something that nobody in the digital group cares for. They would just assume goodwill and saying somebody else is going to take care of it. And within a few years, that leads to hijack, where by the convenience of somebody making legally binding decisions that purportedly represent the interests of the group, eventually it becomes their private organization to do what they want. And I've seen this happen so many times, and I've seen so many others experience this, that there is now the fear of registration, because everybody looks at this and says, the moment you register, we know the path you're going down to. In 2 years, this is going to be dead. So do not register. Exist purely digitally without any legal recognition. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. You can do remarkable things without legal registration. So my own personal example, in 2015, I was part of something called the Save the Internet campaign for net neutrality. We managed to get a national conversation going on internet policy. We managed to get the telecom regulator to change the law. We made this a discussion that went through the entire apparatus of the state, from the regulator to the telecom department to parliament. And the policy change that came out has lasted. It's not gone. It's in fact responsible for a lot of people having internet access for the very first time in this country. But the interesting thing was that entire campaign was not a legal entity. It existed just as a Slack group. Legal recognition was not necessary at all to achieve a very significant outcome. Now, some of the members, including me, went on to create a legal entity afterwards called the Internet Freedom Foundation. But that came after we had the outcome that we wanted, not before. So effectively, registration is not necessary, and therefore members do not care. But when it becomes necessary for some bureaucracy, it inevitably leads to decline because the law is archaic. So what do you do to solve this? So one obvious thing to say is, yeah, just fix the law. Let's look at what's the gap in the law that prevents digital existence and go fix it. And this is slightly dangerous thing to suggest, because policy making runs on its own agendas. It doesn't do what's necessarily being asked for. And we currently have some fairly bad ideas in India. So one of the things that's going to happen, the moment you say that, a WhatsApp group conducting a poll on WhatsApp should be a legally valid decision of a society, the next thing the government is going to look at is, how do you know that this is legally valid? Who voted? We want Aadhaar KYC for WhatsApp. The idea like that is going to come out and say, that idea has already been, in the circuit for a while. And the moment you say digital organization, somebody will say, aha, my chance to do Aadhaar KYC. Okay, so bad idea. Okay, or it'll get worse. It'll become DPI. Because you want digital records of group decisions, let's create a platform for it that is hosted by the government. And unfortunately, DPI in India is not imagined as enabling rights. It's imagined as consolidating power, and is specifically power to exclude, not a method to include. So we shouldn't be doing this. What we are doing instead is to say, this has to be a little more ground up and say, use existing mechanisms, find a way to do this without asking for policy change until you can show there is groundswell interest in such an idea. And I've been working on a bunch of these ideas. Now, I'm not a lawyer. These are not legally vetted. I will find out if it works or not when I get sued for it. So one of the things you can do is, as it turns out, we have in India what's called the Indian Partnership Act of 1932 that is still on the books, it's still valid. And it specifically says that a partnership between persons for profit can exist without registering it. If you register, you become a legal person, but you do not need to register. And it's even better. It says you do not even need an agreement. A partnership exists if you say it exists. No agreement necessary. So that's a very nice ramp up. Now, basically, I can say every WhatsApp group is a partnership under the law. It's legally valid. So, potential hack. But what happens when you say, I want to go open a bank account for my WhatsApp group, and my WhatsApp admin is the authorized signatory on the bank account? Not happening. So, effectively, then you need one more hack on top of that. One of the things you can do is to say that, look, you have professional bureaucracy where some other entity operates the bridge and takes your WhatsApp decisions and enforces it, and themselves are not opinionated members of your group, but rather just bureaucrats, implementing the legal requirements. So that's roughly what I'm working on as a way to say, let's build this from bottom to top and not throw it at the top where it'll get hijacked again.
Thank you so much giving this opportunity. अगर जब आज के तारीख में अगर जब पॉलिसी गिग और प्लेटफॉर्म वर्कर्स के ऊपर देखेंगे तो ये जो एग्रीगेटर कंपनीज़ है वो तो 2012-13 में स्टार्ट हुए इंडिया के अंदर, मगर बढ़ते हुई गिरानी में अगर जब आप देखेंगे एक अच्छा सा कंपटीशन था जब नया पहल था। एग्रीगेटर कंपनीज़ जब इंडिया के अंदर आए थे 2012-13 के अंदर, उस टाइम पे कहीं पे भी सरकार के पास या हमारे पास कोई पॉलिसी नहीं थी उस टाइम पे, बट हम लोग सब पॉलिसी क्या होना चाहिए, कैसा होना चाहिए, सोचने में 8 साल लग गए। 2020 में जाके इस बीच में बहुत सारे स्ट्राइक्स हुए, प्रोटेस्ट हुए, जिंदाबाद मुर्दाबाद, बहुत सारे कितना कर सकते थे एज ए यूनियंस बने, ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस बिल्ड हुए, उसके बाद में फेडरेशंस बनाए, अपने अपने स्टेट्स में और सेंट्रल में जितना फोकस कर सकते थे सारे ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस काम किया। 2020 में जाके एक छोटा सा एक मोटर व्हीकल एग्रीगेटर गाइडलाइंस आया, उसके बाद में जब सोशल सिक्योरिटी कोड आया 2020 के अंदर, ये दो भी 2020 में आया। बताओ ये करीब 8 साल का गैप बना एक पॉलिसी के अंदर, पॉलिसी में लाके ये छोटे चीज़ देने, और उसमें आप देखेंगे तो ज़्यादा कुछ नहीं है। अगर जब सोशल सिक्योरिटी के अंदर अगर जब बात करेंगे, सिर्फ गीग वर्कर्स, प्लेटफॉर्म वर्कर्स को एक सोशल सिक्योरिटी दे के सीमित नहीं रख सकते, तो सिर्फ उसमें सोशल सिक्योरिटी तक ही दे के बात रखे। उसके बाद में ये बड़ा 3 साल से बैक टू बैक ये लड़ाई फिर कंटिन्यूस होती रही, बैक टू बैक सरकार से, हुकूमत से जाना, रिकमेंडेशंस देना, रिप्रेजेंटेशंस देना, बहुत जगह इस चीज़ के ऊपर बहस शुरू हो गई, जब जाके एक बर्न फायर हुआ। उसके बाद में 2023 में पहली बार इंडिया के अंदर जो है एक काबिल तारीफ़ की चीज़ हुई कि राजस्थान सरकार ने वहाँ पे गीग और प्लेटफॉर्म वर्कर्स के ऊपर क़ानून बनाया। जब वो क़ानून बना, वो बनने के ऊपर भी यहाँ पे बहुत सारे लोग हैं, मैं नाम लूँगा तो भी कम है उसमें, तो उसमें रात दिन हम लोग ने मेहनत की। उसमें पॉलिसी के अंदर वहाँ पे भी अगर जब आप देखेंगे एग्रीगेटर जैसे कंपनीज़ फिर भी वो चीज़ को मानने के लिए नहीं थे कि ये चीज़ अभी भी इंडिया में नहीं होना चाहिए, इसके वजह से कंपनीज़ जो है पीछे जाने के चांसेस रहते हैं, डेवलपमेंट रुक जाता है इंडिया का। सोचो आप, बीते हुए 8 साल, ये 2 साल, ये 3 साल, करीब 11 साल हुए बाद में भी, आफ्टर 11 ईयर्स, फिर भी जो है कॉन्करेंट पॉलिसी इंडिया के अंदर बनने में बहुत हम लोग कमज़ोरी थी, हमारी कमज़ोरी भी थी। बट बने बाद में इम्प्लीमेंट, राजस्थान का जो पहला स्टेट बन गया, वो इम्प्लीमेंटेशन करके हम लोग ने उसको एक रोल मॉडल बना के पूरे स्टेट्स में, अब नेक्स्ट लाइन में हमारे कर्नाटक है, तेलंगाना है और केरल है, बहुत सारे स्टेट्स अब उसको वो मॉडल को अप्लाई करने के लिए और मॉडल को फॉलो करने के लिए काम स्टार्ट करे। ये पॉलिसीज़ में भी हम लोग एक सोशल सिक्योरिटी तक की सीमित नहीं देखना चाह रहे, और गीग और प्लेटफॉर्म वर्कर सिर्फ ओला, उबर, स्विगी, जोमेटो तक ही सीमित नहीं है। आज प्लेटफॉर्म पे अंदर अगर बात करेंगे, गीग और प्लेटफॉर्म के अंदर बहुत बड़ा स्कोप है। अगर जा नेक्स्ट ई कॉमर्स के अंदर हम देखेंगे, फ्यूचर ऑफ वर्क के अंदर अगर जा देखेंगे, बहुत सारा यहाँ पे ओपन अम्ब्रेला है, बहुत सारे वर्कर्स को यहाँ पे इस फील्ड में अभी जुड़ सकते। मगर आज भी कॉन्क्रेंट अगर जा पॉलिसी, अगर जा उनके लिए फ्यूचर वर्क के अंदर अच्छी पॉलिसी अगर जा केंद्र सरकार, राष्ट्र सरकार अगर जा इंटरेस्ट लेके नहीं बनाएंगे, एक सेंट्रलाइजेशन पॉलिसी तो इसके ऊपर होना ज़रूरी है। देखिए, बना के छोड़ना इम्पॉर्टेंट नहीं है, बना के इम्प्लीमेंटेशन लाना सबसे बड़ी इम्पॉर्टेंट है। इम्प्लीमेंट कब होता? जब सरकार अपने अपने स्टेट गवर्नमेंट, सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट जो है, कलेक्टिवली उस पॉलिसी को इम्प्लीमेंटेशन करे, अपग्रेडेड करे, अपडेटेड करे। अगर जब तक वो पॉलिसीज़ के ऊपर अपडेटेड नहीं होता, वो पॉलिसीज़ बना के भी फ़ायदा क्या है, ना के बराबर है। क्योंकि ये एम्प्लॉय, जो ये वर्कर्स है, जो रोज़ कुआँ खोद के पानी पीने वाले लोग हैं, इन लोग को अगर जो आप देखेंगे, जैसा सुबह हम लोग सुने डीएक्टिवेशन की बात हो रही थी, कॉप जैसा दूसरे कंट्रीज़ कंपेयर टू इंडिया करेंगे, वहाँ पे हमारे से ज़्यादा डेवलपमेंट हुआ। हम आज के तारीख में भी उनके साथ चलने के लिए हम लोग एज ए यूनियंस, एज ए फेडरेशंस हम फाइट कर रहे बैक टू बैक। क्योंकि अभी कोऑपरेटिव की जैसा अब हमारी बात हो रही है, अगर जब हम इंडिया के अंदर मॉडल लाना चाह रहे हैं, तो उसके लिए हमारे पास अवेयरनेस, हमारे वर्कर्स में अवेयरनेस होना चाहिए, हमारे पास कानून में वो ताकत होना चाहिए, हमारे पास जो जो मूल चीज़ है, जो पॉलिसी के अंदर हम पिच करना चाहिए कल के फ्यूचर के लिए, ये सारे चीज़ ग्राउंड रेडी करके कोऑपरेटिव मॉडल भी इंडिया में आना चाहिए। बहुत सारे चीज़ अगर जो हम मिस कर बैठ रहे, तो अगर जो कोऑपरेटिव मॉडल के अंदर पॉलिसी बने बाद में भी इम्प्लीमेंटेशन नहीं हुई, तो कहीं ना कहीं कमी पेशी दिख सकती। यहाँ पे अगर जो आप देखेंगे, आज के तारीख में भी डाटा के ऊपर, डेटा के ऊपर अगर जो देखेंगे, अगर ना डेटा के साथ साथ अगर जो आप बात करेंगे, तो हमारे हर चीज़ में एल्गोरिथम में भी आप देख सकते हैं, एआई पे भी देख सकते हैं, ये सारा लगाम जो है, कंट्रोल जो है, आज भी एग्रीगेटर कंपनीज़ पे है। अगर जो इसके ऊपर फ्यूचर में ये चीज़ के ऊपर अगर जा इंडिया जैसा डेवलप कंट्री अगर जा फोकस करके पॉलिसी नहीं बनाएगा, कॉन्क्रेंट इनके ऊपर रूल्स एंड रेगुलेशंस नहीं बनेंगे, तो मैं समझ रहा हूँ अभी भी कमी पेशी है। तो उसके लिए एज ए यूनियंस, एज ए फेडरेशन हम लोग बराबर इसके ऊपर लड़ रहे, फाइट कर रहे हैं। इसके ऊपर कहाँ तक हम लोग हासिल कर सकते हैं, वो हासिल करने के अंदर हमारा जीव जा लगा रहे। बट एट द सेम टाइम सरकार भी इसके ऊपर सोचना पड़ेगा, जैसा कर्नाटक गवर्नमेंट, राजस्थान गवर्नमेंट सोचा, उसके बाद में अब कर्नाटक सोच रहा, तेलंगाना सोच रहा, ऐसा हर स्टेट वाइज में भी इसके ऊपर बातचीत चलना चाहिए। स्टेट गवर्नमेंट भी रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी लेना चाहिए, सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट भी रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी लेना चाहिए, और नेशनल इशू जब इंटरनेशनल इशू में बन जाएगा, तो जब भी जो है पैन इंडिया में नहीं, वर्ल्ड वाइज में हम इसके ऊपर जो है, जैसा कि आप देखेंगे G20 में भी इस चीज़ पे बात बोली थी कि पॉलिसी के अंदर उन्होंने बोला कि सोशल सिक्योरिटी, डिग्निटी की बात करी थी उस टाइम पे। बात करना एक अलग चीज़ है। ग्लोबल प्लेटफॉर्म्स पे हम सब, आप देखे होंगे एग्रीगेटर कंपनीज बीते हुए 3 साल से हर प्लेटफॉर्म पे ILO जैसे कॉन्फ्रेंसेस में, बहुत सारे कॉन्फ्रेंसेस में बोल रहे कि आप बैठ के बार्गेनिंग, कलेक्टिव बार्गेनिंग क्यों नहीं करते। बट एग्रीगेटर कंपनी स्टिल नो 10 साल के बाद में भी बैठ के कलेक्टिव बार्गेनिंग करने के लिए तैयार नहीं है। तो ये कमी पेशी कहाँ पे है, ये चीज़ को हम फुलफ़िल करना चाहिए पॉलिसीज़ में। पॉलिसीज़ इतने स्ट्रांग होना चाहिए कि सिर्फ ना कि सिर्फ पॉलिसी बोल के, दिखा के, जेब में रख के या अपने पास रख के बैठने से कुछ नहीं होता। उसको इम्प्लीमेंटेशन सख्त एक्शन पे करना चाहिए। जो राजस्थान में हम लोग ने लाया वो क़ानून में बहुत सारी चीज़ है, अगर जो आप निकाल के देखेंगे, तो वो एक ऐसा प्रोविज़न है, एक ऐसा हथियार है कि कहीं न कहीं एग्रीगेटर जैसे कंपनीज़ को काम करने पे और काम कराने पे सरकार ले रहे, सो सीरियसनेस उसके अंदर दिखता। तो मैं थैंक यू गिविंग दिस अपॉर्चुनिटी एवरीवन।
So, Salauddin sir is the president of the Indian Federation of App-Based Transport Workers, which is a federation of different unions of gig workers in India. He talked about how about 8 to 10 years have passed between the platform economy really starting up, and so the policy, the lag in the policy is at least 10 years old. And in these last 10 years, only in the last 2 years, we've achieved some kind of movement on policies that help gig workers. First with a change in the motor vehicles aggregator guidelines, then with the code on social security, which was both passed in 2020. But even in these last 2 years, even these last 3 years, with these laws being passed, there's been little done to implement them. And in the last 3 years, the unions and the federation have spent a lot of time giving recommendations and representations, fighting within the federal structure of the country. But implementation has been a challenge. He talked a lot about the Rajasthan government law that is the first kind of substantial law that's come out to help gig workers. And the federation and gig workers are hoping that it serves to be a model of implementation, not just a model law. And this has the scope to cover many kinds of gig workers. And I think the emphasis of Salauddin's pitch was that we need to move towards implementation. So I'll pause here, and Trebor, please, if you could leave us with your last pitch.
Like Anita Gurumurthy said, it's a very complex, of course, and a very broad question to address policy. So I think my heart is always split because I'm sort of half European, and there you would have a very different approach than in the United States. But I can very much share the sort of sentiment of our previous speaker who, and we have experienced this ourselves, worked with the Social Democrats in Germany who made a policy directive to steer towards platform cooperatives that has not really led to any concrete support, as far as I can see. And there have been a few of like that, right? From the British Labour Party, the Argentinian Congress, the European Union, there are now 2 OECD papers on platform cooperatives. So there's a fairly broad embrace, but what is happening for the workers? Right? What is actually happening? What is actually implemented? And so this is why a few colleagues and I wrote this policy paper that really focuses on municipalities and what municipalities have done concretely, right? And this comes out of conversations like when the City Hall of San Francisco called us and basically said, we really want to introduce platform co-ops in San Francisco, but we also just cut 11 bus lines. Right? So in other words, we have just absolutely no funding, right? So how do we make this happen? And so this comes out of these conversations with the City Hall in Melbourne as well, but where they had the similar impetus, and we thought like, well, what can those groups actually do? So this is a very practical approach, right? Looking at what people in Preston in the UK did, what people in Bologna in Italy did, what people across France did, Germany, and we also have a section on Kerala. So, and walked away with just a few recommendations. So I think we heard about the drivers co-op this morning, right? Which is really, wouldn't literally not sit here if there wouldn't be procurement support from the city, right? So that I think is key. But there are other things as well, legal research, right? So in the United States you have 50 states which have at least 5 distinct type of co-op law. So it becomes quite, difficult to navigate. So this is, I think, also true, in Kerala. So the municipalities can support or states can support legal research that actually figure out how these ownership models can be incorporated and legalized. And I'm not going to touch on all of these. You can just download the paper, right? Way too long, with like 120 pages, so really spelling out what they did. But some really powerful things, like I was particularly, my heart really started to beat faster when I learned about what Bologna did in response to the pandemic, which is, so what is the power of a city, right? So it's limited, as we saw with Barcelona, right? So Francesca Bria implemented a lot of fantastic things, but it's a city, right? So there are clear limits. But nevertheless, Bologna, for example, just convened the stakeholders, right? Everybody from the elderly to shop owners, to the library, to the university, to unions, to cooperatives, and said, what do we do in response to the situation? And then they decided that a platform co-op was their way forward, right? And they then, supported that to an extent, but they didn't implement it, right? but they used their convening power to further this. All right, so there are many more things that are outlined here: tax incentive, public benefits, public spaces, right? So we see this a lot with unions that from Barcelona, but really around the world, have supported platform cooperatives and even started some. The SEIU in Los Angeles, the largest public employee union, has started a platform co-op for nurses. So you see that there are like very different ways in which those municipalities can support. So I just recommend you, and I want to keep it short, just study the paper if you are interested in what municipalities can concretely do to bring about like a short-term change for concrete projects on the ground. Right?